Let me be clear, I love CRPGs, I love jumping into the behind-the-scenes mechanics and delight in nothing more than unraveling potential character builds and putting them to the test on the harder difficulties. I thoroughly enjoy stories filled with nuance or freedom and choices, hopefully with meaningful narrative consequences, but most of all, I just want to design and play my own character and be immersed in a creative world. And on that note, Tyranny has achieved that in virtually every regard. For reference, I've spent well over 100 hours with this title and completed it at least twice on Path of the Damned, that being the highest difficulty. The first full playthrough taking me a little under 30 hours, with the second attempt a little under 20. And I can confidently say that Tyranny is a thoroughly enjoyable title. It's flawed in places, and some I am very critical of, certainly, but the takeaway message here is that it's definitely worth your time. In this review, I won't show any big spoilers of the game's story past the first few minutes. The world of Tyranny is certainly appropriately named. In it, you play as a Fatebinder, an adjudicator of practically everything. Nearly all of civilization is ruled by Overlord Kairos, a mysterious but clearly powerful entity with the ability to cast region-wide edicts that can cause complete destruction of the land and its inhabitants. As a Fatebinder, you are her or his messenger and judge and must make sure everyone, including Kairos' own forces, abide by the established laws. Kairos' gender, then, is not a choice you make at the start of the game, but rather serves as a key example of the disjointed governance and its people, the bureaucracy that is the main attribute that makes this particular world sinister, or evil. But as confused or ignorant its citizens might be, the consequences are a very real threat, and Tyranny does an excellent job of constantly integrating these numerous lore elements. An edict is not merely a background set piece, it's something you are directly involved in from the very moment you step into this world. And this immediately is where Tyranny shows its strengths. The start, quite simply put, is very well done. You're not a confused lost soul who's trying to find out where he needs to go as you stumble over the local bear or goblin population, simply trying to survive, as low-level RPG characters might often do. No, you're a hardline judge, handing out death sentences to lawbreakers and slaughtering rebel forces for daring to stand against Kairos' rule. The game kicks off with a conquest mode, a pick-your-own-adventure that shapes the backstory of your character's actions in the current war against the Tears, the last remaining bastion of independence, as you assist the Disfavored and Scarlet Chorus, Kairos' two main armies in this section of the world. There is no clear good or evil faction in this story. The Scarlet Chorus are a ruthless bunch of maniacs that do give their enemies a chance to join instead of die, how nice, and the Disfavored are an elite honor-bound force with a sheer hatred for anything not from their more cultured northern lands. Your choices in this conquest mode shape your faction's initial reaction to your presence through the use of a reputation system, but in some places certainly shape the world as well, as you get to decide which faction controls which portion of the land here and there, and upon visiting it yourself, can see your choice in effect. It's nothing too major, but it is a competent way to guide you into the world while changing your experience in subtle ways. Act 1 then kicks off with you joining the fray against a group of enemy combatants who have risen up against Kairos' rule. As before, the Disfavored and Scarlet Chorus had been tasked with dealing with these rebels, but due to their inherent overwhelming differences and their generals' hatred for one another, have thus far failed to conquer this section of the land. You are then tasked with carrying out an edict of complete annihilation of anyone within the region, unless one of Kairos' forces manages to claim the main enemy's stronghold. This premise works as a great introduction into the world of Tyranny, and allows for your character to have a lot of authority, as even those who outright hate you know better than to disrespect your position of Fatebinder. You're there to question anyone and everything, and are open to achieve the ultimate goal in any way you see fit. It doesn't drown you in exposition either, which may be something you'd expect considering your character's supposed knowledge of the world. Rather, Tyranny utilizes a clever system of optional dialogue highlights which explain core lore elements, as opposed to NPCs explicitly stating every point. The result being that your experienced Fatebinder is just that, without you, the player, being overwhelmed. Furthermore, Tyranny handles narrative motivation very well, as the story shows you plenty of brutal efficiency and yet also incompetence within Kairos' ranks, giving you plenty of justification for choosing one choice over another while being very freeform on the outset. Ultimately, these choices don't feel shoehorned or nonsensical, giving you a lot of room for your own interpretations. The story eventually works its way into one of 4 significantly different playthroughs. The game is pretty clear in what direction you're going narratively, but regardless, it is important to understand that a lot hinges on Act 1. Sadly, it is virtually impossible to reconcile with a faction you've left in the dirt at a later stage of the game. something that definitely would have improved a feeling of choice and is likely one of the more, but very few, disappointing lacks of freedom in this title. The end of Act 1 entirely decides which of these story playthroughs you're able to do. At any given point you can, luckily and delightfully, betray any and everyone in the game, resulting in a 4th fallback playthrough option, but the other 3 require you to make the right allegiances as you near the end of Act 1. These 4 different narratives do make for good replay value, as they certainly are a different experience. Yes, you ultimately visit a lot of the same places, and some of the major key story points are the same regardless, but it is filled with plenty of story events, characters, and otherwise narrative moments that you can't and won't experience in every version. The various characters on that note are certainly another interesting element of Tyranny. The Archons, the generals, or otherwise powerful leaders of Kairos' forces are impressive and intimidating in their own right, and interacting with them is thoroughly enjoyable. Companions, of which 6 exist in the game, are certainly partial to a specific side, but through sheer loyalty or fear, which isn't all that hard to achieve, will stick by your side regardless, meaning you never have to worry that a narrative choice will nerf your party's effectiveness in combat, and they make their varying opinions known plenty. They certainly could do with a bit more fleshing out, but are enjoyable and memorable enough in their own right. Tyranny offers more narrative choice than most CRPGs and should be applauded for having these 4 virtually different story playthroughs, and they're far from your only choices, as each version offers its own obstacles and ways to get past them without resorting to obviously black and white answers. Each feels full of risk, intrigue, and plenty of regret, and manages to stay interesting throughout as you have to decide for yourself how rigorous you will follow Kairos' laws. From story choices to gameplay choices. Before the Conquest mode, Tyranny has you pick the groundwork of your character. In Tyranny, you do not select a class and stick with it throughout, but rather pick attributes and weapon styles that you spend the entirety of the game improving and building upon through talents and magic spells. When I first opened up Tyranny, I spent a lot of time milling over the potential combinations and builds that I could make through talents, spells, and abilities, and ultimately there are quite a number of options to go for that seem workable and functional, even on the harder difficulties. But it is certainly a mixed bag. Importantly, Tyranny itself handles very well. Everything is relatively easy to understand, and navigating across the world at large, be it in or out of combat, is fluid and without annoyances. If you wish to open a lockbox, for example, you merely need someone in your party to be able to open it, and whichever character is closest to said lockbox will simply open it, even if they themselves normally can't. There's no awkward, finicky work involved here. The Freeform character builder is very enjoyable and allows you to focus on creating a character you truly find fun to play from a gameplay perspective, as you gain experience in every skill simply by using them. There's a number of interesting elements from a build perspective here too. For instance, opting to go for the unarmed weapon style completely changes your defenses to dodging, as you can't parry weapons simply with your fists. Attributes double dip as it were with wits and quickness, for example, both increasing your dodge score. Basically, there is a lot of potential min-maxing for you to do, at least in theory. Luckily, this min-maxing doesn't clash much with role-playing either, something that can certainly plague RPGs quite easily. Athletics, subterfuge, and lore are your dialogue skills and are very rewarding to opt for, as they give you additional experience every time they're used. As a result, they are quite easy to level up, and you won't feel pressured into taking a high wits attribute score, for instance, in order to pass those lore checks and come across as a knowledgeable and intelligent character. The cutoff points in passing these checks are rather forgiving, allowing you to easily go whichever route you wish to take. This also plays into stealth. These types of games can often have rather tedious movement in order to avoid stepping into nasty traps. Due to the nature of how you level up skills, you will likely always have someone with a decent enough subterfuge score to spot traps, so you won't feel pressured into taking a specific companion you might not otherwise like just to get those stealth checks. Even if you don't have the required subterfuge score to disable and highlight nearby traps, you can still spot them yourself, as they are nicely integrated into the map design. If you do spot and disable a trap, you then get subterfuge points for your entire party of 4, meaning you can quite easily spot these throughout the entirety of the game. Ultimately, although there is a point to be made for having a more hardcore difficulty experience, I feel most of these elements are tedious at best, and Tyranny has a great approach in making the entire experience more fluid and enjoyable. Another strong point in the way this system works is that it allows for a lot of micromanagement of characters, which can feel more interactive and entertaining than more simplistic, passive auto-attack builds, though you can still opt to go for these if you prefer. Every character can be given a lot of active and useful abilities, resulting in a very micro-intensive playstyle that requires your attention in combat, and throughout Path of the Damned I found these builds very rewarding to play. Even more abilities are given to you in the form of per rest or per combat specific abilities, most of these coming from the reputation system. Importantly, none of these are crucial, and Tyranny manages to balance them well in such a way that you won't obviously be disadvantaged by not being overly nice to a companion or keeping in a specific faction's good graces. Meanwhile, they're not useless either, they simply look fantastic for starters, and almost all of them can have a good swing value, resulting in them essentially being ultimate abilities that you can use every now and then, but are never pressured to. On the flip side, this does represent a lack of resource management that can make harder difficulties more interesting when executed well, and Tyranny doesn't make up for this void in any real way. Alas, the Freeform character builder falls apart due to a few crucial elements and results in it being more limiting on harder difficulties than it could have been. A key gameplay element that factors into all of these builds is the so-called recovery speed. As combat is real-time with pause, every action that a character does incurs both an animation and a recovery speed penalty. Animation speed is largely not something you can affect, with a few exceptions such as the paralyzed negative condition, but recovery speed is sadly dominating when it comes to character builds. For instance, I found heavy armor entirely worthless due to the immense heavy recovery penalty it incurs. Simply put, putting on heavy armor makes all your characters far too slow to be useful. The result being that deflection, a different defensive property, is a much better route to go with, that can simply be done by stacking the finesse attribute and wearing light armor, resulting in fast, maneuverable characters that will still likely live just as long as your immensely slow, heavy-wearing companions without being utterly useless in every other regard. Similarly, recovery speed makes the entire magic talent tree, if not worthless, significantly worse. This talent tree is obviously meant for spellcasters, but most importantly offers staff weaponry increases, and due to the recovery speed a staff attack incurs, you actually never want to hit with a weapon on your main spellcasters, making the talent tree rather worthless for your mage. Finally, combo abilities that are shared between your main character and a specific companion, require you to wait for both characters' recovery cycle to be done before they can be executed. The end result is quite obvious. You want to lower your recovery speed as much as you possibly can, and this severely limits the effectiveness of certain weaponry and completely invalidates the use of heavy armor, resulting in far fewer effective builds than there could have been, not to mention resulting in a lot of useless loot. The second main flaw of this combat and build system comes down to how magic spells are handled in the game. What I found very enjoyable of this element is that spells have to be discovered and unlocked as you go along, and can more or less be built and customized throughout the entirety of the game. This truly added to the enjoyment of the title in finding new ways to customize my uses of spells for my mages and made up the lack of interesting talent choices in a big way. The problem with the system, however, is how much it rewards the use of magic in the first place. They balance out spells in contrast to each other quite effectively, by having bigger spells have bigger animation times, again playing into the highly important recovery speed element of combat, resulting in even the basic touch spells being useful, as they are inherently faster to cast and depending on your build are still a very viable option at higher levels. In fact, my entire monk character, as it were, relied on the use of these lower level spells and did so excellently. Now the main issue is how fire and forget these spells end up playing out. I mentioned how Tyranny handles per rest abilities as being more ultimate abilities rather than a crucial resource management, and I think this is more than fine if it were balanced out by another element requiring more attention, but this isn't the case. This is further affected by the rather contentious choice of not including friendly fire, something that did exist in Obsidian's previous title Pillars of Eternity. At the start, I did not feel like the game suffered for a lack of friendly fire, but soon you realize how easy the game starts getting as you go along, and how utterly effective magic is with no real downside. A fireball, or even a rain of fireballs, instead of being a tactical well-aimed element, instead becomes a rather easy fire and forget spell that does a lot of damage with little to no thinking involved. In the end, due to there being no real resource management, no mana, no energy, no crucial per rest abilities, and everything simply being cooldown based, and there being no friendly fire either to add a risk element, the game sadly devolves into a fire and forget rotation playstyle of all of your characters. Ultimately, where the game starts off so strongly and offers real challenge where it's truly very rewarding to see your build function in the early and middle stages of the game, at the higher stages this completely falls off and becomes more repetitive than challenging or interesting. Essentially around level 15 or so you can hardly ever lose a battle, and sadly this does trivialize what could have been some incredible boss fights. And this is where we sadly get to another downside of the title, namely enemy variety, or rather the lack of it. This is in part due to the nature of the universe in which you're mostly fighting a number of factions, and as such it is at least story appropriate. Around the end of Act 1 you've made enemies and you've made friends, and you largely stick with these throughout the entirety of it, and as such will never really face a lot of change. Sure, they do have their own variations. Bronze Brotherhood members like to swing hammers. Fire magic is reserved for the Scarlet Chorus, and the Disfavored like nothing more than knocking you to the ground while being unkillable bullies in general. But separately, these factions hardly ever grow or introduce new challenges. The Bane, essentially arcane ghosts, are an attempt at non-humanoid enemies, but sadly, in and of themselves they have little to no variation, and basically come in 3 different versions. At first, they offer an interesting change of combat pace as they mostly use these AoE clouds of magic around themselves, but as they afterwards never shake things up again, they too fail to introduce enemy variety to Tyranny. Then last, but certainly not least, is another major downside to the game, and that being Act 3. Or rather, how incredibly rushed Act 3 plays out, which affects both gameplay and story. Gameplay mostly in the sense that it introduces new interesting weapons that you will never really get to use, and story in the sense that events move far too quickly near the end. Alas, it doesn't introduce much side content for you to explore either, and what is already a relatively short title by RPG standards is then certainly not improved by its sprinting through its final hours. I started this review by saying how much I enjoyed Tyranny and how much I think it is worth playing, and again, that is the main message I want to send here. It is very flawed in places, but all the same, it is a very competently made, reactive CRPG that will give you plenty of hours of entertainment. Visually, the title looks stellar, with impressive landmarks and great spell animations. The universe is an interesting setting that has you ponder over the nature and forms of evil actions, as you think about what choices you should make and when, and does so competently in 4 largely different potential story playthroughs. All the while it never gets frustrating, and stays an enjoyable, albeit too easy, but decent micromanagement combat experience, and I can't wait to see what is next in store for Tyranny.